Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Becca Corso, Assistant Professor of Education at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. It's such a pleasure to join you at the Pedagogy 2025 conference to share our reflections on emerging theories, teaching, and technology. This work is titled Turning Outward from the Start: Community Identity and Collective Reflection. In this presentation, I will introduce the context of a course I've built and a big question that surrounded the development of the coursework. Unpack a problem of practice in why traditional reflection typically falls short. Discuss the meaning of outward-facing pedagogy, what it is and why it seems to matter. Identify outward-facing pedagogy in a case study of the course EDU 110, Teaching Diverse Learners, through fieldwork and digital storytelling. Reflect on lessons learned and what changed in practice. And then discuss a balance of the local locus of reflection, the inward and outward growth. Finally, I will discuss a broader impact and how this model can be applied beyond education itself, discussing key takeaways and inviting you all to reflect with me further. What if teacher preparation began not with individual reflection, but collective reflection? That question reshaped how I built this course and how we introduce our students to teaching at Stonehill College. It also inspired the design of Teaching Diverse Learners, a first-year foundational course that reframes teacher preparation through outward-facing, community-based, and collaborative lenses. In many teacher preparation programs, the first semester and the first years center on why someone wants to teach. Students are writing personal philosophies, reflecting on their past learning experiences, and examining educational theories. Those are truly valuable steps, but they often remain deeply siloed. When I first developed this course, I knew that something was missing in our program. Students were typically reflecting in isolation, especially early on in the program. They were incredibly thoughtful and sincere always, but their reflections typically stayed on the page. They rarely heard how their peers were thinking about the same questions they were asked. They also weren't thinking deeply enough about their own identities and how those identities are connected to the communities they hope to serve. So I began to ask myself the question, what would happen if we designed reflection to be relational from the very start? What if the foundation of teacher preparation were not solitary and inward, but an outward practice of shared meaning making? And that was the spark for Education 110's redesign, that effort to make collective reflection a working act for the group that helps new teachers understand themselves through community rather than apart from it or siloed. The problem of practice with traditional reflection is that it often positions students as solo observers rather than participants in the work. A typical reflection might end with, well, I learned that blank. But that learning often only exists with an individual voice. That inward focus can unintentionally create distance between the pre-service teachers and the communities they seek to work with and teach in, between the theory and the practice, and among the peers that are sitting side by side in the classroom with me together. And in an increasingly diverse and interconnected world of which the course seeks to discuss and unpack, the separation there limits students' growth. If we as educators want to be responsive and relational for our students and our community, then the preparation must model those same qualities that we want in teachers. The issue here isn't reflection itself, it's how we frame it when we're building our coursework. When we treat reflection as private or purely academic, we miss the potential to highlight the dialogue, where learning is shaped by the exchange of stories and perspectives and experiences of those who are experiencing it. To introduce this term outward facing pedagogy, I will discuss the combination of field engagement and shared reflection that the course embeds. Drawing from research with Wessels et al. 2024 and Van Ree et al. 2023, outward-facing pedagogy emphasizes the idea that students learn best when they engage with the world beyond the classroom, and they return to reflect collaboratively on those experiences. Wessels described this as doing justice to the complexity of an interconnected world, encouraging learners to see themselves as entangled with the world around them, both being shaped by and shaping their own social environments. Whereas Van Ree and colleagues write about an open pedagogy, adding that students are co-creators when their work starts to reach a wider audience than themselves. They're no longer passive recipients, but active contributors where learning has real public meaning. So I sought to build on those ideas and define this outward-facing pedagogy as providing opportunities for students to engage in experiences outside themselves and to collectively direct cycles of reflection and learning. So this is about designing learning that moves outward into schools, into communities, into conversations. And then it does cycle back inward through that shared reflection and that deepened understanding in oneself and about oneself. So this matters wholly in teacher preparation. Today's teachers are entering classrooms that are linguistically and culturally diverse, and they're shaped by incredibly complex systems. Preparing them through individual journaling and theoretical discussions doesn't fully equip those teachers to navigate the complexity of that world. By starting with outward work through that early community engagement and the structured collective reflection, we're helping teachers fully develop empathy and cultural awareness and habits of learning with themselves and others. I like to think, what if fieldwork and identity reflection aren't necessarily a capstone of a teacher program, but a doorway into it? Shifting the mindset of the teacher preparation program, of myself as the educator, of the students involved, to a community-based practice, one that begins with seeing, listening, and dialoguing with community members. Making that complexity the entry point rather than the end point of teacher education. Now, the course Education 110, Teaching Diverse Learners, is a case study of this idea. Let me describe how this plays out in practice. Ed 110 is a first required course in a series of 3 first-year courses to introduce foundational ideas about diversity, inclusion, equity practices, while also embedding an early pre-practicum field-based experiences with 2 hours a week in local partner schools, where students are visiting and observing teachers and students in the field. The course rests on these 3 intertwined components: the early school-based fieldwork, scaffolded identity reflection, and that culminating digital storytelling project, the podcast project. Each element reinforces the others. Students aren't just reading about culturally sustaining practices, they're seeing it, they're discussing it, they're creating public-facing reflections on what they're learning together and building ideas off of one another in the course. The course then becomes a living case of outward-facing pedagogy, learning within the community, not just about it. So that first component of this concept, this outward-facing pedagogy, is the early fieldwork. Very early in the semester, the students in this course begin their field placements in a nearby classroom. These are authentic, everyday learning spaces, not idealized demonstrations. These are real teaching environments with all of the complexity of the world. The students in this course are observing lessons, assisting teachers, and may gradually take on small support roles. After each visit, we gather as a class to structurally debrief what they've observed in open conversation rather than singular siloed written reports. These conversations are where the transformation happens. Students are sharing what surprised them, what challenged their thinking, what they noticed about inclusion or linguistic approach. They're listening to each other's perspectives and realizing that their peers might have noticed entirely different things in the same classroom or very similar things in entirely different contexts. And through those early dialogues, the students are starting to see how their own identities shape what they perceive, how listening expands your own perception. Moments where the students are reflecting truly illustrate how collective reflection turns observation into genuine and deeper understanding. The second component of this course is the shared reflection through podcasting. The course typically concludes with a group podcast project, which serves as a capstone of the collective learning from the field-based work. Each group chooses some questions deeply rooted in the themes of the semester. Some examples are: what does inclusion look like in practice? How do teachers affirm students' identities? Or how do schools address systemic barriers to equity within their buildings? So students are scripting, discussing, planning, and recording, and then editing their episodes, weaving in the ideas from our course readings, the frameworks and themes, and their personal observations. Remaining anonymity and FERPA compliant conversations as well, because the podcasts remain within the shared collective class. They do not present outward and aren't public facing outside of the class at this time. Students are capturing the pedagogical intentions of the course with this work, being open, collaborative, and reflective. So the openness, the idea that a podcast is meant for a public audience, even when the podcast is being presented within the course itself and not externally, the students are deeper in their thinking about care and accountability with their language and how they're representing their ideas about students in classrooms. The collaboration requires negotiation, compromise, and shared authorship between classmates. And the reflectiveness, of course. Students are synthesizing what they've experienced and discussing what others experienced, asking further questions, and making more shared meaning. So in many ways, the podcast functions as both process and product. It's the dialogue and the artifact of that dialogue itself, which are the most important components. So for me as the instructor, these projects reveal students' growth through something other than a test score. But I see their voice expand. I see their empathy expand and the quality of students' questions expand. They show reflection as active and creative and outward facing all at once. Across the semester of redesigning the course, a few consistent themes emerged, not necessarily as research findings at this point, but my own professional observations from the practice. The reflection became relational. Students were shifting from what did I learn to what did we learn together. Their writing and discussions reflect awarenesses that understanding grows through dialogue. Second, I feel students' identity exploration deepened, as did mine. Students heard each other share bias moments, belonging moments, surprising moments. They began to notice their own assumptions more clearly and hold their own assumptions more deeply. With more accountability. And third, the connection between the coursework and the fieldwork strengthens. Instead of viewing the field as separate from theory, students are using class readings to interpret what they saw. Their reflections are moving beyond recounting just events into analyzing the systems and strategies at play. And thus, professionalism is expanding. Students are sharing their ideas and they're taking them seriously. Together, all of these outcomes, to me, reflect that this practice of collective shared reflection cultivates community and confidence. We must also balance the locus of reflection. Of course, outward-facing pedagogies come with their own complexities. When reflection happens publicly or collaboratively, not all students feel equally comfortable sharing. Some may fear judgment or pressure to agree with group norms. Others may find that their personal insights are really hard to say in a shared space. whether it's a confidence concern or a difficulty in articulating their thoughts on the spot. But addressing this, I've learned the importance of balancing this inward and outward reflection. Um, so what I've planned to build and students are doing is balancing the outward and inward locus of reflection by also conducting a personal reflection after the public podcast. So that balances the personal and the communal, and you have the public dialogue pushing thinking outward, but also the private thoughts, allowing students to pause and question and even center their own voices in the context. So it's less of a tension now after understanding the balance and more of a cycle of introspection and then connection back. So both are essential, and the challenge really I find is designing for the balance. This does to me have implications beyond teacher education. Collaborative reflection and early community engagement really can transform any foundational course. If folks are engaging early with authentic context, if they're collaborating reflectively on what they've encountered or experienced or have thought about something, or if they're producing renewable work, public facing or group facing work, they're contributing to a community. And when that reflection becomes shared, the learning is more collective. And when that happens, teaching is community work. As I look back on the redesign and my pedagogical approach, I'm really thinking about how simple this shift really is, but how transformative it is and can be. It doesn't always require technology like podcast equipment or major funding, but it can require a mindset change. It asks us to trust that students themselves, even in the early stages of a program, even in this case in their first semester, can engage meaningfully with communities, classrooms, their peers, and trust that their voices will become even more strengthened and heard and negotiated when they share them together. So, in this approach, I really believe that students are seeing themselves not just as future teachers, but as members of the profession because they're grounding their work in dialogue, in empathy, and in connection, the true themes of the course as well. So that's the heart of outward facing pedagogy ultimately, that reflection isn't the end of something, it really is the beginning and the process. So thank you so much for listening, and I welcome any continued dialogue and collaboration. You should feel free to connect with me at rcorso@stonehill.edu, and I hope everyone has a fantastic rest at the Pedagogy 2025 conference.